Please join me in offering a warm welcome for Father Moloney.
So we arranged the slides so that if you are up there, you should be able to see everything on the slides. If you're sitting in the front, we have a handout for you, which will help you in case I'm in the way of the slides. So that's the main purpose. There should be roughly the same sorts of things on them. Okay. Good. So in recent years, important voices in the Vatican and the Synod of Bishops have drawn a contrast between the Church's doctrine on the one hand, and what is merciful or pastoral on the other. The doctrines are praised as true and just, and no argument is brought against to change these doctrines in themselves, right? So especially even tough doctrines, like the doctrine about marriage is for life and it can't be divorced. Those are the things. That doctrine is awesome. We're going to keep it. But however, it is argued when these purportedly praiseworthy doctrines are applied to real, actual, concrete situations, well then merciful and pastoral considerations should lead the Church to allow the faithful to not practice what the doctrines teach. Pope Francis, in his closing address, get that here. What's going on? So Pope Francis, in his closing address to the first part of the Synod on the Family back in 2014, described several temptations that he noticed among the Synod participants, including the one I have here on the board, which I'll read to you. The temptation, he said, there are different temptations that members of the Synod have shown. One of them is the temptation to a destructive tendency to goodness that, in the name of a deceptive mercy, binds the wounds without first curing them, and treats the symptoms and not the causes and the roots. He calls it the temptation of the progressives and the liberals. Then, in doing what he's doing here, talking about binding the wound, he's referring to his metaphor of the Church as a field hospital. And he complains that the progressives at the Synod of the Family had proposed something that was not only false, but intended to deceive others, when under the name of mercy, they propose instead leniency, when they pretend to care for the sinners in the field hospital, but have no interest in actually helping them to get better. Bishop Barron at World Youth Day, someone told me they were there, and they said he used an example of what some people are talking about is not a field hospital where they help people in the chaos of the world to get better, but rather a field hospice, right? Hospitals ain't making someone better. Hospices just make them comfortable while they die. And a lot of the thing progressives are trying to do is make people comfortable as they experience a spiritual death. That's his joke. But implied in this criticism of a deceptive mercy by the Pope is a notion of true mercy, one that's different from mere leniency. True mercy attempts to make people better, to right wrongs, to heal their wounds and not just cover them with useless bandages. Leniency, on the other hand, is the mere setting aside of the standards of justice and what is right. It's a false imitation of mercy because it attempts to lower the high standards of what is right. It's a false imitation of mercy because but you lower the standards in order to accommodate the wrongful sinner, where true mercy tries to lift the sinner up to grow him closer to the standards of justice and greatness. So rather than moving the standards down, you move the person up to the standards. Now, in and around the Synod on the Family in 2014 and 2015, especially in the first session, which provoked the Pope's comments above, the progressives used language about setting aside of Church's teaching in the name of mercy. So that was in the 2014-2015. They used mercy as the reason for setting aside Church teaching. In and around the Synod on Synodality in 2023-24, which is, one of the first part has been completed. The next part's going to start again, I think, in October. the language that they were using was, we're going to set aside the church teaching, not in the name of mercy, but the name of being pastoral. That pastoral considerations are the reason we should set aside the doctrine. You can see, by the way, I put this slide up here, which I don't think is on your sheets. Cardinal McElroy, who's been a gift that keeps on giving for this talk, says all the things that I wanted someone to say, and he just puts them in a couple of articles. But he just he says here, the primary pastoral imperative is to heal the wounded, and the powerful pastoral corollary is that we are all wounded. And just think about that for a second. If we're all wounded, then nobody is ever healed, right? Because presumably nobody could be healed. Because if we could be healed, then someone probably is healed, in which case we're not all wounded, right? If it's not all, then it's some. So the Pope's idea of mercy is that it's supposed to heal the wounded, but if Cardinal McElroy, like progressives, think that healing is not possible, for example, if chastity is impossible for the unchaste, then yeah, all that we can do is accompany people, which is what he says here, right? The church should be one of accompaniment and inclusion of love and mercy. Now he uses the language of healing rather than binding, but I think His Eminence just walks right into Pope Francis's criticism from some years earlier, where he doesn't think that those who are divorced and remarried, who are unchaste, can get better, ever. And so to challenge them to get better is actually not to be merciful, and to be merciful is not to challenge them. And so I think the point that we're all wounded that he's making in this section is meant to say that we're not in a position to judge a man who dumped his wife for a younger model, because our own woundedness, right, means that we have a kind of solidarity and woundedness with the divorced, the LGBT, and so on. But then he says we're all the last line, we're all equally in need of healing. If that's the case, that would mean that after baptism, when you're no longer under the jurisdiction of original sin, and we've been practicing prayer and asceticism, right? If a lifelong monk is equal in his woundedness to a sex addict, and we're equally in need of healing right now, not some point in the past, well, this smacks of the Luther's doctrine of simul justus et peccator, right? That grace does not heal us or make us stronger and holier, but simply hides our wounds. So the Pope Francis said, hey, people are just binding wounds and not actually healing them, and Cardinal McElroy years later gives you this quote. So the point I was making earlier is that we have this idea that 2014, 2015 they use the language of mercy. In 2023 they use the language of being pastoral. But the change in language masks a fundamental similarity. Right? I want to suggest that all these concepts that are used by progressive Catholics are basically the same, or at least are susceptible of a similar analysis. So they say we have justice on the one hand and mercy on the other. And we should balance them out, or justice should be as opposed to mercy, or doctrine on the one hand and being pastoral, being prudent on the other. We talked about we have the doctrines and the law, and then we have discernment. Or doctrines of the law versus accompaniment, or another thing that people have talked about is gradualism. And I'll talk about all these in detail. But all of these positions hold that there is all these pairs, the ones on the left, or the justice doctrine side, they all hold that there is an official correct answer. But in the name of the stuff on the other side, it's supposed to be adjusted downward or even set aside, right, in response to those who fall short of it. So I have, the next part of the talk is going to lay out some of the mistakes that people make and sort of categorize them and show and sort of distinguish them philosophically. So the errors I want to highlight are all characteristic of progressives, as Pope Francis himself noted. And the quotations below are either by self-identified, quotations we'll see are either by self-identified progressives or are attributed to them by reporters or other observers of the synod or official reports of what people were discussing in the synods. The quotations are either largely from documents relating to the Synod on the Family in 2014 and 15, from participants in either the Synod on the Family or the Synod on Synodality. There are no documents from the most recent synod, that's why. or from reports of the conversations that were being had in the synodal halls. My intent is to show that real live important people in the church are deploying these mistaken ideas when thinking through important issues. That's for this next part of the paper. Okay. So the first mistake is to see being merciful or being pastoral as being sharply divided from, the ideas are mercy is opposed to mercy is on the one hand, justice versus strict justice is something different, distinct. They're opposite, opposed to each other. The second one is mercy is the same as leniency and punishing. The third is that mercy involves setting aside the laws or rules or doctrines in the name of mercy. Or mercy involves setting aside general laws or general rules in this particular case. Another idea is of a different sort, is that mercy is greater than justice. Similarly, mercy is God's greatest attribute, greater than his justice. Another kind of dimension, or people say the person who shows mercy to a sinner should not make demands beyond that sinner's moral strength. Therefore, and this is where the mistake is, the call to holiness should not be proposed to a sinner in the name of mercy. And finally, mercy, or sometimes called gradualness, allows one to counsel the sinner to commit lesser sins, ostensibly as a path to escaping greater sins. So I'm going to talk about all of these with some more detail, but I have the quotes are coming up. So the first mistake is to say that being merciful or being pastoral is sharply divided from or even opposed to justice or strict justice or doctrine. So oftentimes you'll see the language of balancing mercy with justice or doctrine with pastoral care, pastoral practice. That's an example of this sort of mistake. Because they have to be balanced, it means they're not intrinsically related. They're two things, and we have to weigh them against each other. The idea actually has a pedigree. So Portia, from the famous Quality of Mercy speech from the Merchant of Venice, speaks of how mercy seasons justice. But this idea contains a deep conceptual mistake, as we'll soon see. For example, one example of this is Cardinal McElroy again. The exclusion of men and women because of their marital status or sexual orientation or activity is preeminently a pastoral question, not a doctrinal one. Given our teachings on sexuality and marriage, how should we treat remarried or LGBT men and women in the life of the church? The church is called to proclaim the fullness of its teaching, not to complaining about the teaching, but while offering a witness of sustained inclusion in its pastoral practice. So we have this teaching, but really the practice is what sets the tone. Or another quote here, and this is from the report of it from the Catholic News Agency about the Synod on the Family. I've got 2 slides here. Mercy has emerged as a major theme in the Synod of Bishops as the discussion has moved forward, with many participants emphasizing that while mercy is greatly needed, it must always be linked to truth, because that was how they framed things, not justice, but truth. The question is not whether we are here to change doctrine, of course not, but to make sure that pastoral care takes account of real, actual, concrete situations of what each person is doing. This is a quote of one of the Synod participants. The proclamation of the gospel and the embrace of God's mercy are 2 equally valid and intrinsically related aspects of life. They're balanced. Yet another participant said that the doctrine, that in order to view the Church's doctrine on marriage in the light of mercy, requires both attention to the pastoral dimension and the application of the Church's teachings, which are 2 separate things. Okay. And there's a bunch of other examples of this mistake. For example, a couple right here. Those who oppose elements of the pastoral mission of the Pope frequently argue that doctrine can't be superseded by the pastoral, but it's equally important to recognize the pastoral can't be eclipsed by doctrine. They're 2 separate things. And then he even goes further a few months later. It's not that doctrine comes first, but doctrine stands in service to the pastoral mission of the Church. So what we teach is secondary to how we apply it. Okay. A more specific version of that general mistake, which treats mercy and justice and doctrine as opposites, is to claim that mercy is reducible to leniency and punishing, or that being merciful or pastoral involves setting aside the laws or rules or doctrines in real concrete cases. Like the first mistake, it requires having already decided that being merciful or pastoral is in some deep tension with justice and church doctrine. We see here, this is the Instrumentum Laboris, was an official document from the Extraordinary Synod, and said, in summarizing the first session of the Synod on the family back in 2014 and 15, they said, responses and observations from some Episcopal conferences emphasized that the Church needs to equip herself with pastoral means towards the divorce, which provide the possibility for her more widely exercising mercy, clemency, and interestingly, indulgence towards new unions, that is, remarriage. So that's a bit more concrete. We have to sort of take the general ideas and provide the possibility of exercising these towards the new unions. A third mistake is to think that being merciful or being pastoral involves setting aside the laws or doctrines in this particular case. This often is what progressives also mean by discernment, or using the language of making things concrete. In the case of divorced and remarried couples, for example, holders of this view argue the general law prohibiting such couples from receiving communion could be, or must be, set aside, when doing so might make coming to Mass more inviting. The mistake is that this confuses mercy with equity, which is the act of applying a general law to a particular case. So we have a long quote from, it's on 2 slides, from Cardinal Cocco-Palmiero, who is the president of the Pontifical Council for Legislative Tax, stressed that doctrine must be absolutely safeguarded. We're not touching the doctrine, but we should also start from individual cases and from their concrete situations. And so in the summary, again, this is from the Synod on the Bishops from the 2014, the director of the Holy See Press Office says, in general, we can see roughly 2 lines are emerging at the Synod. One line strongly affirms the gospel requires that if there's a prior valid marriage, and one's contracted a second civil marriage, then access to the sacraments is not possible. The other line, although not denying the indissolubility of marriage, because the doctrine we're not touching, wants to discern particular situations, approaching them with mercy. Similar point is made here. In the big document summarizing the report, the conversations in the Synod on the Family, Cardinal Erdo says, it is necessary to accept people in their concrete being, to know how to support their search, to encourage the wish for God and the will to feel fully part of the Church. This requires the doctrine of the faith be proposed alongside with mercy. Again, therefore, while supporting a general rule, it's necessary to recognize that responsibility with respect to certain actions or decisions is not the same in all cases. Pastoral discernment, while taking into account a person's properly formed conscience, must take responsibility for these concrete situations. A fourth mistake, is of a different kind, is to hold that mercy is greater than justice, or that mercy is God's greatest attribute, and especially greater than his justice. The argument seems to be deployed to suggest that mercy is not only opposed to following rules or doctrines, but that breaking with those rules or doctrines is somehow holier than following church teaching. Now, in addition to the problem of treating mercy and justice as opposites, as we've already seen, there are additional theological problems with this idea. Mercy can only be shown to creatures, for example, since God does not show mercy to himself within the persons of the Trinity. It can't be like God the Father looks at God the Son and says, well, I'm forgiving you for that you just did, right? That doesn't make any sense. And mercy towards creatures is only necessary when there's something wrong with creation, since nobody shows mercy to the perfect. So, which means that mercy would not be necessary in the following circumstances. Before creation, when it was just God, no need for mercy. Before the first sin, when there's nothing wrong. Or after the second coming, when there will be no sin because everything will be rightly ordered. No need for mercy under those circumstances. And so, since at sometimes there is no mercy, mercy cannot be a term describing God who is eternally and essentially, In contrast, there are no such limitations to describing God as just or wise or good or one or existing. So justice can be an essential attribute of God because there's no limitation on it, while mercy cannot. Justice is a pure perfection, mercy is a limited perfection. And we see, I wrote a review of Cardinal Casper's book on mercy, which I made this point. So I pointed out that he's basically walking into a Trinitarian heresy, where he says things like this. that mercy does not undercut, mercy is not opposed to justice, it surpasses justice, which is another way of opposing it. And Cardinal McElroy says that the lived experience of human sinfulness and human conversion are vital to understand that the central attribute of God in relation to us is mercy. Another mistake that people make, it begins from a defensible premise that to be pastoral and loving means that one should not make demands beyond the sinner's moral strength. So that's fine. But those making this mistake then conclude from that premise, invalidly, that therefore holiness should not be proposed to the sinner. The fear of those who advocate this view that holiness should not be proposed to the sinner, the fear is that merely preaching the Church's doctrines on divorce and homosexuality would be horrifically off-putting to those whose lives are structured around those sins. Now, this is a mistake because of the difference between demanding and proposing. A priest can propose to his congregation through the homily the heights of the Church's teaching on sexual ethics, and then right away after Mass offer absolution to a penitent who is deeply habituated in certain sexual sins on the condition that the penitent, who can't without any confidence promise to amend his life successfully, but you can say, well, look, if you want to amend your life, or even more weakly, want to amend your life, then I can grant you the absolution. There's no contradiction between proposing the heights of the Church's teaching and then not demanding something someone who's weak who has very little moral strength. So the demands you make in the confessional will be in accord with the moral strength, but the fullness of the teaching is also proposed to the person. On the other hand, to not even preach the Church's doctrine is one of the clearest examples of what Pope Francis called a deceptive mercy that binds the wounds without first curing them and treating them. And again, I think Cardinal McElroy is useful. He says that the pastoral theology of Pope Francis demands that moral theology not demand a change in life first, but instead begin with an embrace of divine love. And finally, participants in the synods have argued that mercy, or sometimes use the alternative language of prudence or of gradualness, allows one to counsel a sinner to commit lesser sins, ostensibly as a path to escaping greater sins. So the idea is that pastoral prudence should lead people one step at a time, graduus is step in Latin, as you know, so gradually, one step at a time, towards what is right. And this is, of course, an aspect of true mercy, and shows mercy's realism. It focuses on this person, his motivations and circumstances, how to get him or her to make steps. But one cannot, in the steps the person takes must be towards right belief and action, because you can't, in the name of gradualism or prudence, change the standards of rightness to make them easier. Prudence is a virtue that determines what is right in individual situations, but it's not a way of ignoring what is right. Nor can one counsel sin in the name of gradualness, as in, well, to sin in this way is lesser to sin in that way, so it's a step in the right direction. So go ahead and sin. We cannot ever counsel people to sin. Right? This is St. Paul's rhetorical question to the Romans. Should we sin? Of course not, he says in Romans 6:1. And so we have examples here about this law of gradualness. So, as regards the possibility of the divorced and remarried partaking of the sacraments of penance, the Eucharist, for some, partaking of the sacraments might occur were preceded by a penitential path with all sorts of checks. That this would not be a general possibility, but the fruit of a discernment applied on a case-by-case basis according to the law of gradualness that takes into consideration the distinction between a state of sin, a state of grace, and the attenuating circumstances. This is a school of thought proposed by some in the Synod. And the Relatio appears to reflect a move among the prelates from legal exactness and adherence to church teaching to graduality, a theological notion that people can grow in their holiness or in their adherence to church teaching over time. And there's something there, but there's also, it has to be moving you towards the right answer. It can't just be not moving you towards the right answer. So again, these mistakes are being made by leaders in the church and participants in the synods of bishops. They're made by bishops and cardinals, especially those with progressive bent. when challenged on the misuse of the term mercy, back in the first of the two synods we've been talking about, they switched up to using other words, but the general structure remains the same. Rather than lifting up the fallen to the high standards of holiness the Church is bound to maintain, the progressives wish to lower the standards to the point where they are easy for the fallen to reach. So the next part of the talk, I want to argue this fundamental move is a misunderstanding of the true nature of mercy and pastoral practice. I think mercy is best understood as the virtue that seeks to right wrongs. That's a big summary of the too long didn't read, right? Mercy is the virtue that seeks to right what is wrong. St. Thomas Aquinas describes the divine virtue of mercy as that aspect of God's goodness that removes privations and defects, thereby making the formerly defective creature better and more good. So it's an aspect of goodness. Properly speaking, he argues mercy is only given to remove defects in rational creatures. Not every removal of defects, for example, removing dirt from clothes, non-being from the not yet created, is an act of mercy, strictly speaking. If there is no wrongness to right, there's no privation or defect to remove, then God's mercy just does not come into play. Human mercy is best thought of in the same way. The idea that mercy is about righting wrongs, or removing what is wrong, is most clearly seen in the works of mercy. So the merciful person clothes the naked, buries the dead, instructs the ignorant, and generally attempts to remove the privation in the person who is in need of mercy, at least to some degree. So the naked are deprived of clothes. Clothing then removes this privation. The ignorant lack education and knowledge. Instructing them helps to remedy that, expelling their lack. The dead are unable to bury themselves, and the presence of unburied dead is a disorder according to God's plan, so to bury them removes the disorder. In each case, the work of mercy is a response to a wrong, to a certain privation of what is good or of right order. Good, when talking about a thing, we talk about what is good, and of right order is how we talk about society. In which the person who is motivated by mercy seeks to remove the privation or to right the wrong. Now, it might seem this definition of mercy is particularly intuitive in the case of the works of mercy, where we want to lift up the person to the standard of what is right. It also makes the mistakes that we've seen about mercy above particularly clear. So, when talking about the works of mercy, it's not appealing to argue that mercy involves lowering our high standards of what is right. So, for example, we do not want to lower the standards of being clothed and well-fed, so that it's easier for the naked and starving to be clothed or well-fed, right? You wouldn't say, well, hey, I gave a naked person a mitten, and that technically we're just going to now say they're not naked, so we've done our job. Or I've given a hungry person a saltine, so they've been fed, so I've fed the hungry, and box checked, I've done a work of mercy, right? So basically you don't want to lower the standard in the cases of the works of mercy. Well, similarly, someone who offers the goal of works of mercy is to remove the privation or to right the wrong in reality, and not just to reflect the standard, to reduce the standard of success downwards. So it's clear that when thinking about the works of mercy, talking about mercy as righting a wrong works very well. But it also applies to other contexts where leniency or adjusting the standards downward might seem like an attractive way to think of mercy. So for instance, in punishment contexts, it might seem that to show mercy implies not punishing, or punishing someone less than he deserves. Yet in punishment context also, a better understanding of mercy is that we want to right the relevant wrongs. With respect to the criminal, there's more to it than this, but with respect to the criminal, punishing is, or the wrongness, I should say, is in his will, the criminal's unwillingness to uphold the law. His will would be right were he to decide to uphold the law going forward. So for the punishing authority to be merciful, to right the wrongness of the offender's will, one goal of punishment would be that the offender convert to become, or desire to become, a law-abiding citizen ever after. So the wrongness is he doesn't want to follow the law. The rightness would be if he decides that he now wants to follow the law. If we can say that just citizens are those who have a will to uphold the law, we can also say that merciful punishers want today's offender to become tomorrow's just citizen. Well, clearly then, mercy aims at justice in punishment contexts, including justice in the decisions of the offender. We want to have a rightness about the will of the defender. Mercy towards sinners, and not just towards criminal offenders, is also a righting of wrongs. And like in the punishment context, mercy, including God's mercy, that's directed towards sinners, aims at righting the wrongness that is in their will. St. Thomas calls this type of punishment medicinal, because its purpose is to make the sinner better. In medicinal punishment, the goal is conversion, that the sinner stops sinning and become like the saints who are holy. Holiness is the name for rightness in spiritual context, which makes holiness a species of justice. Thus, in moral and spiritual context also, mercy aims at justice and rightness. This is in fact part of why St. Paul's discussions of justification seem like he's talking about saving and being merciful and lifting people up. So the understanding of mercy as righting wrongs requires a corollary in the definition of justice. Justice is best understood as related to rightness, and not simply etymologically, where jus is the root, means right. Aquinas describes God's justice as giving order to the universe, maintaining a proper order among creatures. Human justice also tries to bring about some portion, some vision of how things could be better or rightly ordered. And even in our expanded contemporary use of the term justice, which we have environmental justice and gender justice and racial justice and animal justice, as well as criminal justice and international justice, and it's just a partial list. In each case, the operative notion of justice gives some account of how things ought to be when they are right. Someone with the virtue of justice in each area desires that rightly ordered state of affairs and works to bring about that rightly ordered state of affairs in justice and race and things like that. Now, this is kind of the Roman law definition of justice as giving to each his own. Aquinas sometimes uses this, and it's a traditional definition that comes from Roman law, that justice is giving to each what he is owed. That's different from what I'm proposing here. And someone defending that definition might object to my definition of justice as simply rightness, saying that's not traditionally what we mean by justice. But I would count that the Roman law definition of justice only is a specific example or specific instance of what is right, a specification of justice as rightness, and so involves. But it's not the genus, but it's simply a species of it. It would seem possible that the right thing to do would be to give someone more or less than he is owed sometimes. Right? The right thing to do might be to punish someone less than he deserved, or the right thing to do might be to give someone money that he does not deserve. If what is right, if the right thing to do is to give someone differently than what they deserve, so you say justice is what is deserved and what's right is sometimes different than that, then you're saying the rightness and justice pull apart, which would mean that sometimes to do justice is to do wrong, which seems counterintuitive. The idea that to perform justice can be to do something wrong seems to be behind the first, second, and fourth theories I showed you above, the mistakes above earlier. It seems better to fix the idea of justice as meaning just what's right, what's the right thing to do, and then to argue about whether giving to each his own is right in this circumstance, or whether something else is the right thing to do in this circumstance. So that's a little Thomistic aside. So this understanding of mercy and justice, that mercy is aiming at making things right that are currently wrong, therefore mercy is aiming towards justice, this understanding of mercy and justice makes it easier for the two to be compatible. Right? If we allow justice to mean rightness, and mercy to name the virtue that seeks to right wrongs, to make things right, then mercy comes into play when something is unjust, is not how it ought to be, and seeks to make those wrong things right. The mistaken ideas about mercy that we've seen before assume that mercy and justice are incompatible, at least sometimes. But mercy and justice cannot be opposed to each other ever, and for several reasons. One, the Christian tradition asserts that God is merciful and that he is also justice itself. But God's nature cannot admit of opposed attributes. So either mercy is compatible with, not the opposite of justice, or God lacks at least one of mercy or justice, which I would regard as a blasphemy. So mercy is not opposed to justice. Now, if mercy is the opposite of justice, and at this point, another reason, separate reason, mercy is the opposite of justice, then mercy is unjust, and justice is merciless. But both mercy and justice are desirable attributes, while injustice and being merciless are undesirable. So we can preserve the desirability of both mercy and justice only if they are compatible. Finally, if justice describes a good state of affairs and mercy involves setting aside justice, mercy involves setting aside a good state of affairs, which is not what most people mean when they advocate for mercy. But if justice describes a bad state of affairs, then it's not what most people mean when they advocate for justice. So to elaborate on this last point, many of the progressive participants in the synods, when talking about mercy, seem to assume that justice, or strict justice, which makes it worse somehow, is in some way lesser, and that it pulls apart from a good state of affairs. So if you follow strict justice, what's a good state of affairs doesn't come about. But those progressives who advocate for, other progressives who advocate for justice, like racial justice, assume that justice is an entirely good state of affairs. They wouldn't say, like, well, what we really want to say justice is a lot of racism. They don't want a bad state of affairs, they want no racism, right? So when they advocate for justice in those sorts of contexts, they're advocating what's a good state of affairs. But when talking about strict justice, it's supposed to be bad. So progressives currently seem to reconcile these two conflicting attitudes by talking about mercy only when they want to set aside the rules, as with church doctrines regarding divorced and remarried couples or with same-sex marriages. But they talk about justice, they talk about mercy when they want to set aside the rules, but talk about justice when they want to change society by insisting on the rules. That's with racial or gender equality. They do not frequently talk about mercy and justice generally. They tend not to talk about mercy for racists, for example, or retribution for those who divorce their wives. It seems to be that those two progressive discourses are politically coherent, and that they both employ positive terms like justice and mercy in the contracts that work rhetorically for progressive goals. But they're not coherent conceptually. Discourse about justice and mercy will be more conceptually coherent when we hold justice to aim at a good state of affairs, and then to debate whether this or that thing is justice. So justice is about what's right, what's good, and then if this is justice, then it's got to be something good, because if it's not good, it's not justice. So in the debate about retributive punishment, for example, people want to argue that to give someone what he deserves sometimes yields bad consequences. I don't think you should call this an objection against justice, that justice is sometimes doing the wrong thing, but rather that as an objection to this inadequate understanding of justice, that justice is not, or not always at least, to give to someone what he deserves. So one can imagine cases where the right thing to do is to set aside desert. Let's say, for example, that a society will have less crime in general if prosecutors offer a lesser sentence to a criminal who promises to testify against a drug kingpin. The criminal deserves a certain punishment, which is what the understanding of justice as desert would require. But it would make society worse, less safe, more crime, more disorder, to punish that lower criminal in order to desert, according to desert. The right thing to do is not to punish him as he deserves, which makes not punishing him the just thing to do. Now, this understanding of mercy and justice makes it easier for the two to be compatible. So again, if we allow justice to mean rightness, then mercy is the virtue that seeks to right wrongs, comes into play when something is unjust. It's not how it ought to be. It's aiming at justice. It also follows that wherever that A, there is a coherent notion of justice in a certain sphere, and B, it's possible to fall short of that notion of justice, then there's probably a corresponding idea of mercy that would seek ways to bring about the right state of affairs. So mercy is the virtue that comes into play when something's wrong, so it depends on some other notion of what's right. That notion can be general or specific. Understanding justice as rightness and mercy as the virtue that seeks to achieve or restore that rightness when the world falls short shows how mercy is in the service of justice. In Roman and Greek society, equity was the name for the virtue that applies general laws to particular cases. Since ancient laws were often crudely written, this virtue tended to approximate mercy. So if you consider all of the relevant circumstances when applying a crude law, it tends to make that you mitigate the prescribed punishment. However, strictly speaking, equity is just particularized justice. It's not mercy. So an ideal judge, like God, could perfectly account for every circumstance and still find the person to have acted wrongly and unjustly. So that would be, arriving at that decision is where equity's task ends. It's particularized justice to this exact case, this person, this background, this circumstances could do this and not that. So our ideal judge, once he's achieved equity, would then have to decide how to respond to that wrongness. And that's when mercy would begin. And as we saw above, participants in the synods tended to argue that the general laws of the church are like these harsh rules of ancient Greece, such that to particularize them would be to approximate mercy. But it's not clear how equity would lead to mercy in the areas of the two synods which generated the most progressive support. It's not clear how the general law that says that no person who is in a sexual relationship outside of a canonically valid marriage can receive communion, that's what the law says, how to take that general law and particularize it, so this person is in a sexual relationship, so on, particularizing it would allow them to go to communion without repenting. The church already has a sophisticated process for analyzing whether a particular marriage is real or merely putative. So the general rule plus the elaborate annulment apparatus together approximates the particularizing justice of equity. The annulment process approaches equity asymptotically, not perfectly. There are real cases of divorced people who cannot take advantage of the annulment process for various reasons, and who, were they to seek an annulment, would be granted one, and who have remarried anyway outside the church. And so to apply justice in their cases would require overcoming the obstacles to their participation in the annulment process, perhaps by increasing the number of staff processing annulments and making sure that those who need canon lawyers have access to one. That would help particularize those cases even more. But such technical and bureaucratic refinements do not seem to be the goal of the progressives at the synods who advocate for particularizing and concretizing church doctrine. Nor would any of the attempts to improve the application of the law to particular cases make any sort of difference for those who are in sexual relationships that cannot be raised to marriage, such as those between those of the same sex. Right? No amount of particularization can make such relationships other than sinful. Like, oh, well, you have this rule that says that, two men can't get married, but what about these two men? Also, they can't get married. That's just particular. So talking about things being concrete isn't really what they're about. The goal does not seem to be to apply the law more equitably by taking into account more circumstances. It seems rather just to set aside the law, which we have argued is neither equitable nor merciful. Talking about mercy as leniency, which is probably the dominant mistaken notion of mercy, it causes disorder, right? If justice promotes the goods of order in society, and mercy is understood as the opposite of justice, then to show such mercy would be to work against what is good for society. Criminologists today acknowledge that the crime waves from the 1970s to the early 1990s were largely the result of bad theories of punishment, where progressive judges handed out shorter sentences to criminals, progressive prison officials reconceived prisons as rehabilitation facilities, and progressive parole boards experimented with early release and furlough programs. The rehabilitation programs had little impact on the prisoners once they returned to society, which meant that the shorter sentences and early release programs just returned unrepentant criminals to society more rapidly, and crime as a result skyrocketed. In response, a law and order movement advocated for longer sentences. 3 strikes and you're out laws, like they have in California. And strict sentencing guidelines in federal and state governments limited the ability of progressive judges to assign lighter sentences. An analogous process happened in the Catholic Church, where bishops showed leniency towards abusive priests in the same time, in the 60s and 70s, by sending them to rehabilitation facilities and then returning them to ministry, rather than applying existing canon law. This led to a crime wave of clerical abuse, and in reaction, the Church developed the internal Catholic sentencing guidelines of the Dallas Charter, with its zero-tolerance policy. In both the civil and ecclesiastical cases, a policy of leniency or of quote-unquote mercy that involves setting aside the agreed-upon standards of justice in particular cases serve to undermine the good societal order that justice was meant to promote. Now, anyone involved in running a group over time knows how leniency with a handful of people, or even one, can cause disorder for the group as a whole. If the starting quarterback of the professional team is always late to football practice, and he is so essential to the drills that the team has to wait for him in order to start practice, and the coach decides to be lenient with him and not penalize him for being late, then the schedule of the team will start to deteriorate over days and weeks, and other drills and meetings have to be rescheduled. But on the other hand, if the coach decides to discipline the quarterback for his tardiness, then the overall schedule of the team can be maintained. If mercy is conceived of not as leniency, but as actually disciplinary, as righting the wrong of someone's habits and vices and errors, then mercy can increase order. Discipline is a form of righting wrongs that reaches to the habits and the will of the person who is disciplined. It's a form of instructing the ignorant and giving correction to wrongdoers, which are two works of mercy. That's why the rule of St. Benedict sees discipline as a form of charity and mercy. Now, adapting our punctuality example, imagine that a certain monk is habitually late to Vespers, and it causes the monastery schedule to disintegrate as everyone else sees no reason to be on time when Brother Tardy never is. And the abbot has to step in, right? Rather than simply letting, the example I have on the slide here, the abbot decides not to discipline Brother Tardy, thinking that he's showing him mercy. That's just the way he is. What can you do about Brother Tardy? But as the abbot, he can't have favorites, so he can't just not discipline Brother Tardy. So he has to, it wouldn't be fair to discipline Brother Sleepy for being late, and Brother Tardy's when he let Brother Tardy off the hook. And so the next person is late, he too is punished. And pretty soon Vespers has to start late because too few people are there on time. And the logic is, well, why should I put down what I'm doing? I can work for 5 more minutes because Brother Tardy's going to be late. We know we have to wait for all the late monks anyway. And that in turn throws off the rest of the schedule, and people start asking if they can pray Vespers on their own to get on with their evenings. And eventually everyone's praying Vespers on its own schedule, and the monastery's a disaster. But imagine instead if the abbot had thought about Brother Tardy's behavior in the following way. Well, Brother Tardy needs to care about the other brothers. He doesn't see that there's a reason for the schedule. That's not just an arbitrary set of rules, but that it's designed by our Holy Father, St. Benedict, to order the day towards growing in holiness. So if Brother has a suggestion about how to tweak the schedule so that it better works towards growing in holiness, I'm open. But his constant lateness shows a lack of respect and a lack of love for these other men who have pledged their lives to God in this community. If I discipline him, I'll be helping him to see this, and I hope he will learn to love his brothers better in the practical details of our life. I will also show all the other monks that I love them and value their time as well. Right, so that if making Vespers on time is an aspect of justice commanded by the rule, it's a type of rightness of how things ought to be, we can say that in disciplining his tardy monk, the abbot wants to teach him about justice and wants to convert him to desiring justice and to acting on that desire. So as a result, the abbot addresses the disorder in the monk's soul, that he does not care about his brothers, thereby helping him become a better person, while at the same time helping all the other monks by protecting the good order of the monastery. So the abbot's punishment or discipline can thus be seen to help someone who needs help, and that's clearly an act of mercy. Now, currently, progressives show no interest in showing mercy to sex abusers, hence the language of zero tolerance, but much interest in showing mercy to those who abandon their marriage vows or seek sex outside of marriage or are convicted of capital crimes. A correct understanding of mercy ought to present a coherent pastoral approach to all sinners, including those who are not popular. I've argued that there are insuperable philosophical and theological, this is a conclusion, summary. I've argued there are insuperable philosophical and theological problems when mercy and thus good pastoral practice is understood as equity or leniency or the opposite of justice and truth and doctrine. Here we go. Mercy cannot set aside doctrine or justice in the name of leniency or particularity or equity. Pope Francis called it a deceptive mercy and a temptation when progressive thinkers want to lower the standards of justice and doctrine so that sinners are made more comfortable while remaining in their sin. As I have tried to show, many participants in the Synod of Bishops seem to have given into that temptation that Pope Francis flagged. Currently, progressives show no interest in showing mercy to sex abusers, but much interest in showing mercy, as I said, to those who commit other sins that are more popular. So in service of a theory a unified theory of mercy and justice that applies to all these circumstances, I have argued that justice is best understood as rightness. Any further specification of justice, such as giving to each his due, is lacking if it describes a state of affairs that is not always right and good. Mercy is in turn best understood as the virtue that seeks to right wrongs, to remove privations, especially among human beings. Thus, mercy is in the service of justice, order, rightness, truth, and correct doctrine, not opposed to them. Mercy seeks to bring about rightness where something less than rightness obtains. Rather than always seeking to minimize rules and punishment, mercy will often advocate disciplinary measures in order to promote order within society and within the soul of the offender. So, in getting our theory of mercy right matters. If mercy is the desire to right wrongs, then it cannot be opposed to justice understood as rightness. Nor can mercy be opposed to correct doctrine, which is the Church's teaching of what is right. Rather, mercy, and thus pastoral practice, should aim at leading everyone to do what is right according to Catholic doctrine and justice. If we agree that we should want to right wrongs, then our debates can be about the best means of how to do so. Because the theoretical mistakes about mercy that we described earlier, our current debates on certain issues important to progressives are about whether to right them at all. The former sort of debate, however intense, is normal. What's the best means? The latter sort of debate, whether to right them at all, that debate not only creates a climate of mistrust between progressives and the rest of the Church, but is the sort of disagreement that could lead to the evil of schism. We should seek to lift up the fallen to what is right and true, to heal the wounded rather than merely hide their wounds. This is an authentic mercy that is in the service of what is right. Thank you.